Normandy, France, August 8, 1944. The sun has barely cleared the tree line when the ground begins to shake. Not the familiar rolling tremor of artillery, something closer, more deliberate. The German defenders of the fortified hamlet of Putot-en-Bessin press themselves against the earthen walls of their bunkers, squinting through firing slits at the smoke-hazed fields beyond. They have survived weeks of Allied bombardment. They have repelled infantry assault after infantry assault. Their positions are deep, well-supplied, and mutually supporting. By any measure of conventional military logic, they should hold. Then they see it. Crawling across the churned Norman earth comes what appears to be a Churchill tank, familiar enough, if unsettling in its bulk. But trailing behind it on a thick armored umbilical, a low-slung trailer squats on the ground like something dragged from a fever dream. The vehicle lurches forward, closes to roughly 90 meters, and then the world ends in a wall of fire. The jet of burning fluid erupts from the tank's hull with a sound that survivors would later describe as somewhere between a thunderclap and the roar of a furnace door being torn from its hinges. The flame does not merely reach toward the bunker. It floods into it. It pours around corners. It seeks out every shadow. Within seconds, a concrete position that had held off infantry for hours is a crematorium. The men inside have no time to think, no time to surrender. The flame reaches 110 meters. It lasts for roughly 1 second per burst, and there are enough bursts in that trailer to do this 80 times over. From their positions, other German soldiers watch in frozen, primal horror. Several later testified, under Allied debriefing, that they believed in those first searing moments that the British had unleashed something supernatural, something outside the rules of war, something that should not exist. They were looking at the Churchill crocodile, and in the summer of 1944, nothing on any battlefield caused more immediate, visceral terror. To understand why the crocodile came to exist, why Britain poured immense engineering resources into a weapon whose primary tactical effect was arguably psychological, you have to understand what the Allies were facing as they prepared to break Hitler's Atlantic Wall and fight their way across Northwest Europe. By 1943, it had become grimly apparent that modern defensive architecture had outpaced the weapons designed to destroy it. The Germans were building in concrete. Reinforced bunkers, pillboxes, hardened gun emplacements, and fortified farmhouses, all of them proof against small arms fire, largely proof against mortar rounds, and requiring direct hits from heavy artillery shells to guarantee destruction. The problem was that artillery, however devastating in the open field, was a blunt instrument in close terrain. Shells that missed by 10 meters might not even crack the walls, and getting artillery close enough to guarantee hits meant exposing gun crews to the very fire the bunkers were designed to produce. Infantry assault on hardened positions was, in the clinical language of military planning, attritional, which is to say, it killed a great many men for uncertain results. A section of infantry charging a machine gun pillbox faces fire from the moment they are visible. Of the dozen men who begin that charge, the mathematics of enfilading fire suggests that several will not complete it. If the surviving soldiers manage to reach the bunker and destroy it with grenades or demolition charges, they have purchased a single fortified point at significant human cost. And there are hundreds more ahead. The British Army conducted extensive analyses of casualty rates during the Italian campaign of 1943 and 1944, where Allied forces spent months grinding through the Gustav Line, a chain of German defensive positions built into the mountain terrain of central Italy. The figures were sobering. Casualties sustained in assaulting prepared positions ran disproportionately high compared with casualties in open maneuver warfare. The problem, reduced to its essence, was this: a defender in a concrete bunker can be suppressed, but suppression is not destruction. The moment your soldiers charge, the defender simply resumes firing. What was needed was not a weapon that could suppress a bunker from a distance. What was needed was a weapon that could reach inside it, around corners, through slits into the very spaces where men sheltered and make those spaces uninhabitable. A weapon, in short, that could turn the defender's protection into his prison. The principle of flame as a weapon is ancient. Greek fire terrorized Byzantine enemies in the 7th century. Medieval siege engineers used primitive incendiary mixtures. Flamethrowers had appeared in the First World War, both German and British, and had proven immediately effective at close range and immediately controversial. The problem with every flame-throwing system that preceded the crocodile was range, volume, and survivability. A man carrying a flamethrower on his back could project burning fuel perhaps 20 to 30 meters under ideal conditions, required considerable courage to approach that close to a defended position, and was himself a walking fuel tank whom every enemy marksman prioritized. Portable flamethrowers were weapons of the last few meters. They were effective only after the bunker had already been closely approached, which brought you back circularly to the original problem. Vehicle-mounted flamethrowers had been attempted before. The Soviets had experimented with flame tanks in the 1930s. The Japanese had deployed them in the Pacific. The Americans were developing the M4 Sherman Zippo. But none of these systems solved the fundamental constraints: limited fuel capacity, inadequate range, and the catastrophic vulnerability that comes from mounting a large flammable tank on a vehicle that enemy gunners are specifically trying to destroy. The British answer was developed at the Department of Tank Design in collaboration with the Petroleum Warfare Department, a body whose very name suggests the thoroughness with which Britain approached the weaponization of burning liquid. The PWD, established in 1940 in the desperate months following Dunkirk, had spent years investigating the properties of thickened fuel, incendiary mixtures, and flame projection systems. By 1942, their engineers had arrived at a concept that was, in retrospect, elegantly logical: separate the fuel entirely from the vehicle that projects it. The result was the Churchill crocodile. The vehicle itself was a Churchill Mark VII infantry tank, weighing approximately 40 tons, armored to 152 millimeters on the frontal arc, and slow by the standards of armored warfare but almost absurdly resistant to small arms fire and shell fragments. In most respects it looked and behaved like any other Churchill. Its 75 millimeter main gun remained fully operational. Its machine guns were intact. The modification that made it a crocodile was largely invisible until the moment it was used. The flame projector replaced the hull-mounted machine gun, a single, relatively unobtrusive nozzle set into the glacis plate. Connected to this projector by a reinforced armored pipe running beneath the tank's hull was a 3-meter armored trailer, riding low to the ground on its own tracks and sprung to follow the tank across broken terrain. Inside that trailer sat a cylindrical pressure vessel containing 400 imperial gallons, roughly 1,800 liters, circ, of the PWD's specially developed thickened fuel, pressurized with nitrogen gas to approximately 350 pounds per square inch. The fuel itself was the product of considerable research. Standard petrol or diesel, projected under pressure, tended to disperse into droplets that burned briefly and unpredictably. The PWD developed a thickened mixture, a syrup-like substance that clung, that burned at higher temperatures, and that maintained coherence across distance. The nature of the precise formulation remains partially classified, but it shared properties with what the Americans were simultaneously developing under the name napalm, though the British thickened fuel had a somewhat different viscosity and combustion profile. When ignited, it burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius and was extraordinarily difficult to extinguish. Water dispersed it. It clung to surfaces, to clothing, to concrete walls. The projector system worked by forcing the thickened fuel through the nozzle under nitrogen pressure, passing it over an ignition jet of burning hydrogen gas at the moment of projection. A single 1-second burst consumed roughly 4 gallons of fuel and reached under operational conditions between 80 and 110 meters, depending on wind and the angle of projection. The trailer carried sufficient fuel for approximately 80 such bursts, giving the Crocodile a sustained tactical endurance that no portable system could approach. Production of the Crocodile system was handled at several facilities across Britain, with the trailer assemblies manufactured separately from the tank conversions. The Churchill Mark 7 chassis came from Vauxhall Motors factory at Luton, which had been converted to war production and was producing Churchill tanks in substantial numbers by 1943. The conversion kits, the projector assemblies and trailer systems were manufactured and fitted at specialized workshops. Estimates suggest that approximately 800 Crocodile systems were produced in total, though the precise figure is difficult to confirm owing to wartime classification. What is certain is that the weapon entered operational service in time for the Normandy landings of June 1944, and that it would see continuous action until the final days of the European War. The Crocodile's operational debut in Normandy was, by any measure, immediate in its effect. The bocage country of northern France, that maddening patchwork of high-banked hedgerows, sunken lanes, and fortified farmsteads, was precisely the terrain where conventional tank warfare was least effective and where defended positions proliferated. German units holding the bocage could convert a single farmhouse into a fortress that cost hours and dozens of casualties to reduce. The Crocodile changed that calculation with brutal efficiency. At the village of Maltot on July 23, 1944, Churchill Crocodiles of the 141st Regiment Royal Armoured Corps advanced against German infantry holding prepared positions in and around the village buildings. Eyewitness accounts from British infantry supporting the attack described the almost immediate collapse of German resistance once the flame appeared. Defenders who had maintained accurate fire for hours abandoned their positions within seconds of the first flame burst. Several were found to have thrown down their weapons and run, in some cases directly toward Allied infantry lines, seeking surrender over the alternative. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. This pattern repeated itself across the subsequent months of the Normandy campaign and the advance into the Low Countries. At the fortress town of Le Havre in September 1944, the Crocodile was used systematically against the concrete casemates and bunkers of the port's garrison defenses. Accounts from German prisoners taken during that assault contain repeated references to the flame weapons, described in terms that suggest something approaching collective trauma. One prisoner is recorded as having stated, through an interpreter, that when the fire came, there was no choice left to make. The psychological dimension of the weapon is impossible to separate from its purely physical effects. It bears acknowledging here that records of specific Crocodile deployments are incomplete. Operational reports from the 141st RAC and associated units were not uniformly preserved, and some actions remain poorly documented. What the historical record does establish clearly is the weapon's reputation, which spread through German units facing British armored formations with remarkable speed, and which fundamentally altered the calculus of bunker defense in ways that artillery and conventional tanks had not achieved. The comparative context is illuminating. Germany had its own flame tank programs, the SD.KFZ. 251/16 Da, a half-track variant carrying a pair of flamethrowers, had seen service on the Eastern Front, but it was a light vehicle with limited armor protection and a fuel capacity that could not approach the Crocodile's endurance. The Flampanzer III, a converted Panzer III carrying an internal fuel tank and a flame projector, had been used in North Africa and the Soviet Union, but again carried substantially less fuel, roughly 1,000 liters compared with the Crocodile's 1,800, and lacked the armored trailer concept that allowed the British vehicle to separate its most vulnerable component from its most exposed. The Americans, developing the M4A3 Sherman-based flamethrower variants for the Pacific Theater, produced capable weapons well suited to the island-hopping campaign against Japanese fortifications. but the Sherman Zippo, as it was informally known, integrated its fuel internally, reducing the storage capacity available and increasing the risk to the crew if the fuel was struck by enemy fire. The Crocodile's detachable trailer could, in theory, be jettisoned if it was hit, or if the tactical situation required the tank to revert to a conventional role. This was not merely theoretical. Tank commanders in Normandy did on occasion disconnect their trailers when the terrain or the threat profile made them a liability. The concept of separating the fuel from the projector vehicle was not copied directly by any other nation's wartime programs, largely because the war in Europe ended before the lessons could be fully absorbed. However, the Petroleum Warfare Department's research into thickened fuels and high-pressure projection systems fed directly into post-war development of vehicle-mounted flame weapons across NATO, and the Churchill Crocodile's design documents were extensively studied by military engineers in the years immediately following 1945. The actual historical impact of the Churchill Crocodile resists simple quantification, and any honest assessment must acknowledge that ambiguity. In purely material terms, the number of enemy positions destroyed, the number of enemy soldiers killed directly by the weapon, cannot be established with precision from surviving records. What can be established is the disproportionate effect the weapon had on tactical outcomes relative to its numbers. The Crocodile was never deployed in large quantities. 800 systems spread across the full duration of the Northwest European campaign, committed piecemeal to specific operations rather than used as a mass formation weapon. The psychological effect, however, was not proportionate to the numbers. In the calculus of defensive warfare, the knowledge that a weapon existed which could pour burning liquid into a fortified position regardless of how well it was built changed the risk calculation for every defender. German units known to be facing British armored formations with Crocodile capability adopted different tactical postures, withdrawing from isolated strongpoints more readily, avoiding the kind of last-stand defense that consumed lives for negligible gain. Whether this represents a net humanitarian effect, fewer lives lost in prolonged sieges, or simply a shift in the character of violence is a question military historians have debated without consensus. What is not debated is the weapon's influence on the trajectory of the Northwest European campaign. Operations that might have taken days, the clearance of fortified villages in the Reichswald, the assault on Walcheren Island, the reduction of the Channel ports, were compressed in their duration and their human cost by the availability of a weapon that made static defense untenable. The Crocodile did not win battles by itself. It made battles winnable at acceptable cost. Several Churchill Crocodile systems survive today. The finest example is preserved at the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset. The tank and its distinctive trailer sitting side by side in the atmospheric light of the museum's Second World War hall, the projector nozzle still visible in the glacis plate. At the Imperial War Museum in London, related material and documentation from the Petroleum Warfare Department are held in the collections. In Normandy itself, several memorials to the 141st RAC stand near villages where crocodile actions took place, modest markers for a weapon that passed through those fields in a flash of fire and changed everything it touched. Return, for a moment, to that Norman field in August 1944. The German defenders of Putot-en-Bessin are making their calculations. They have concrete and steel and ammunition and training. They have positions that should be impregnable. They have, in the logical framework of everything they know about modern warfare, every reason to believe they can hold. Then comes the fire, and in those seconds, in that roaring, flooding, all-consuming surge of heat, every calculation dissolves. The concrete does not save them. The firing slits do not save them. The training does not save them. Nothing in their experience of warfare has prepared them for the possibility that the very walls they sheltered within could be transformed, in a single second, into a furnace. This is what the Churchill Crocodile achieved that artillery could not. It turned the defender's confidence into the instrument of his defeat. The bunker that made a soldier feel safe became the thing he most feared. the walls he had constructed, the positions he had prepared, the cover he had chosen. All of it became a liability the moment that nozzle traversed toward him. The British did not invent the flamethrower. They did not invent thickened fuel. They did not invent the notion of mounting weapons on armored vehicles. What they invented, what the engineers of the Department of Tank Design and the Petroleum Warfare Department built in the workshops of wartime Britain, was a system that solved, definitively, the problem that had been killing men in their thousands across every theater of the war. They built something that could reach into the dark places where men hid and end the hiding. The Germans who survived called it black magic. The British soldiers who rode it into battle called it the crocodile. The Germans were not wrong.